Burkina Faso did not wake up to the sound of gunfire. It woke up to the sound of silence, the absolute, suffocating silence of 113 bank accounts being frozen in a single heartbeat. Imagine the scene. In the gilded villas of Ouagadougou and the sleek offices of the capital's most powerful men, the plastic cards that once bought influence and immunity suddenly turned to useless scrap. Former presidents, ex-military generals, media moguls who had dictated the nation's thoughts for decades, wealthy businessmen who believed their connections were more permanent than the soil beneath their feet. All of them, in one coordinated strike, were stripped of their financial oxygen. This was not a standard political reshuffle. This was a seismic shift in the African political atmosphere. For generations, the elite of Burkina Faso had operated under a divine right of impunity. They had the money, they had the foreign support, and they had the shields of high office. But this morning, President Ibrahim Traoré sent a message that shattered the fear barrier forever. Power no longer gives protection. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. If you believe in these stories, give us your love, leave your thoughts, and subscribe to continue this journey together. This was a security operation, not a vendetta. The intelligence was bone-chilling. These 113 individuals were not just hoarding wealth, they were allegedly funding a shadow, a plot so dangerous it aimed to decapitate the state, assassinate the president, and hand the keys of the nation back to foreign controllers. For the first time in memory, financial power was treated as a weapon of crime, not a shield of status. For years, the people of the Sahel were told their enemies lived in the desert, that the only threat was the man with the mask and the rifle. But Burkina Faso learned a more painful, intimate lesson: the greatest danger does not always cross the border in a tank. Sometimes, it sits in an air-conditioned office. It speaks politely in a suit. It signs contracts while planning violence in secret. It is the betrayal of the insider, the one who knows the military's heartbeat and the public's psychology, and uses that knowledge to sell the nation piece by piece. The government moved with a speed that left no room for secret deals or court delays. Banks were not asked to cooperate. They were instructed. Properties were sealed. Travel permissions were suspended. The political game, as the elite knew it, died that morning. In its place rose something else, a terrifyingly transparent accountability that asked a single question: where does your loyalty lie? As the investigations deepened, the authorities followed a trail of crumbs that led far beyond the borders of Ouagadougou. They found secret financial movements jumping across borders like a virus. They discovered shell companies and hidden accounts designed to move millions of dollars in silence. They found encrypted messages and meetings held in quiet rooms in foreign capitals. This was not a spontaneous uprising. It was a calculated, well-funded attempt to seize power by force. The goal was brutal in its simplicity: create fear, trigger instability, and strike when the nation was at its weakest. Media campaigns were already prepared to confuse the public, and terror attacks were meant to pull the security forces away from the capital. It was a modern coup, a hybrid war where bank transfers are as deadly as bullets. But by exposing the plot early, the state broke the silence. They allowed the public to see the skeleton of the machine before it could start breathing. At the center of this machinery sat a figure that represented the ultimate betrayal, a sum of money so large it could have electrified 1,000 villages, yet it was being used to burn the house down. The investigators looked at the ledgers and found a number that shocked the nation: $28 million. $28 million secretly mobilized to fund the collapse of Burkina Faso. While the ordinary farmer struggled with inflation, while the mother in the village worried about insecurity, the same elites who claimed to love the country were allegedly buying mercenaries and bribing officers with more money than most citizens would see in 10 lifetimes. The oxygen of the coup was cash, and Ibrahim Traoré had just cut the line. The machinery stalled. The coordination broke down. But as the accounts were frozen and the names were read aloud, one specific name began to dominate the whispers in the street. A name that had once stood for hope, but was now being linked to the ultimate act of treason. The shadow of a former leader was growing long, stretching across the border from a safe haven in Togo, and the evidence was about to become personal. The trail of $28 million led to a discovery that cut deeper than any external threat could. As investigators dissected the flow of capital, they realized they weren't just looking at numbers on a screen. They were looking at the blueprints for a manufactured apocalypse. This money, moved through the shadows of shell companies and encrypted digital whispers, had a specific, dark purpose: to buy the loyalty of those sworn to protect the state. In a world where the poor struggle for a bowl of grain, these millions were being dangled before military officers and media influencers to induce a collective amnesia of their duty to Burkina Faso. The plan was to fund propaganda that would paint a picture of a nation in freefall, creating a psychological vacuum that only a new leadership could fill. This wasn't just a coup of soldiers, it was a coup of narratives, bought and paid for by the very people who had once sat at the high table of national power. Let us take a moment here, not to rush forward, but to give thanks. Write a comment with a simple "thank you" to Traoré, to Burkina Faso, or to the spirit of sovereignty itself. Gratitude is not a formality. It is recognition. It is dignity expressed in words. When you add your voice of thanks, you are not just engaging with a video, you are standing in solidarity with a story of freedom and pride. So, before we continue, take this pause to comment your thank you. Together, those words become a beacon that shines far beyond the screen. The freezing of those 113 accounts acted as a tourniquet on a bleeding wound. Suddenly, the mercenaries waiting for their final payment found themselves unpaid. The media voices prepared to broadcast the fall of the government were silenced by the sudden lack of incentive. The machinery of betrayal stalled because its fuel, untraceable cash, had been seized by the state. It was a masterstroke of financial warfare that proved a revolutionary truth. When you follow the money, you eventually find the truth. But the truth revealed a name that many found hard to swallow: Paul-Henri Damiba. Only a few years prior, Damiba had been the man the world watched. He had come to power with the promise of being the strongman who would finally secure the borders and bring peace to the Sahel. Yet, under his watch, the violence did not stop. It intensified. The hope he promised turned into a bitter harvest of instability. When he was eventually removed by the young officers led by Ibrahim Traoré in September 2022, many believed he would fade into the quiet obscurity of exile. They were wrong. Power, once tasted, is a difficult thing to surrender. From his exile in Togo, Damiba is now accused of orchestrating the very chaos he once claimed to fight. The intelligence services of Burkina Faso have pointed to intercepted recordings and financial links that suggest he was the central architect of the plot. He wasn't just a spectator, he was allegedly the coordinator, using his remaining loyalists within the military and media to bridge the gap between foreign interests and internal traitors. This revelation hit the public like a physical blow. To think that a man who had worn the uniform, who had stood before the flag, was now allegedly plotting to return to power over the bodies of his own countrymen. It forced a national conversation on the nature of leadership. Was power a tool for service, or was it merely a prize for the highest bidder? The extradition requests sent to Togo were met with a heavy silence, a silence that only served to confirm the suspicions of those on the streets of Ouagadougou. As the Boykan expanded, it became clear that this wasn't just a local dispute between two military men. It was a collision between two diametrically opposed visions for Africa. On one side stood the old order, a system of dependency, where local elites acted as middlemen for foreign interests, maintaining a fragile stability that only benefited a few. On the other side stood the vision of Ibrahim Traoré, a messy, difficult, but fiercely independent sovereignty that refused to take orders from foreign capitals. The foreign shadows moving behind Damiba weren't marching with rifles. They were moving with contracts and influence. They were the actors who found a self-reliant Burkina Faso uncomfortable. A nation that says no to exploitative alliances is a nation that threatens a global status quo that has existed for decades. The coup plot was meant to be a reset, a way to push the nation back into the familiar arms of dependency. The cost of this reset was meant to be paid in Burkinabe blood. In the weeks leading up to the asset freeze, the country saw a suspicious spike in violence. Terrorist attacks began to look less like random acts of extremism and more like a coordinated effort to soften the nation's resolve. The strategy was simple: make the people feel so unsafe, so exhausted by the chaos, that they would welcome any change, even a return to the old, corrupt order. But the planners of this coup made one fatal mistake. They calculated the value of the money, the strength of the weapons, and the reach of the media, but they forgot to calculate the spirit of a people who have finally woken up. They expected fear. Instead, they found a wall of unity. They expected silence. Instead, they found a roar. As the links between the frozen bank accounts and the funding of terror activities were made public, the moral line was crossed. The realization that their own elites might be profiting from the very terror that was killing their sons and daughters acted as a catalyst for a national awakening. The streets were no longer just places of commerce. They became the front lines of a revolution. The political atmosphere of the entire Sahel had shifted, but the true pivot point was not found in a government decree. It was found in the hearts of the people who refused to be spectators in their own destruction. As the state tightened its grip on the frozen assets, the opposition attempted to mount a counter-narrative. They spoke of due process and investment climate, trying to use the language of international diplomacy to shield what the government described as a den of vipers. But the counter-pressure from the streets was an immovable object. You are part of something bigger than a channel. You are part of a community that refuses to let these narratives be written by outsiders. If you want to join that community more deeply, if you want to support the team bringing these stories to life, become a member. Your contribution directly funds better research, deeper investigations, clearer truth. You are not just supporting Bright Africa. You are supporting every leader, every nation, every voice fighting for independence and dignity. The choice facing Burkina Faso was stark: allow the old networks to regroup under the protection of foreign interest, or perform a radical surgery on the body politic. Ibrahim Traoré chose the scalpel. This turning point meant that the state was no longer willing to play by the rules of a game that was rigged against its own survival. When the government revealed that the assassination plot was not just a domestic quarrel, but an international operation involving foreign money and external networks, the choice for the average citizen became even clearer. Investigators had traced secret financial movements that acted as the nervous system for this coup. Money was no longer a neutral tool for trade, it was evidence of a planned massacre. The revelation that more than $28 million had been mobilized specifically to pay mercenaries and bribe officers acted as a shock to the national conscience. It created a profound doitrong, a counterweight to the influence of the wealthy. For decades, the rich believed they could buy the future. Now, they found that the one thing they could not buy was the silence of a nation that had seen behind the curtain. The pressure on the young administration was immense. Foreign capitals whispered threats of sanctions, and international media began to sharpen their pens, painting the asset freeze as a move toward authoritarianism. Yet, inside the country, the reaction was the opposite. The people did not see the loss of elite bank accounts as a loss for the nation. They saw it as the reclamation of stolen air. The choice made by the government to prioritize national security over elite comfort was a gamble that relied entirely on the support of the masses. This support manifested in a way that modern coup plotters never expected. Instead of the confusion that usually follows such a massive disruption, there was a strange, focused clarity. From the capital of Ouagadougou to the streets of Bobo-Dioulasso, the people took to the avenues not to mourn the stability of the past, but to guard the sovereignty of the future. They understood that if the coup succeeded, Burkina Faso would return to being a piece on someone else's chessboard. The government's strategy of public justice served as the final response to the internal and external pressures. By broadcasting hearings and explaining the evidence, they removed the mystery that usually surrounds political power. They showed the people the encrypted apps, the shell company documents, and the intercepted calls. This transparency was the ultimate weapon against disinformation. It turned the legal process into a national education, teaching every citizen how to spot the signs of a manufactured crisis. As the suspects, military officers, businessmen, and media owners sat in the same courtroom, the hierarchy of the old world collapsed. The sacred cows were no longer sacred. This was the choice the nation had made to heal its own wounds, even if the process was painful and the world was watching with a critical eye. The transition from a state of impunity to a state of accountability was not just a legal shift, it was a moral revolution. The shadows of external actors still loomed, and the extradition of figures like Damiba remained a point of friction. But the message from Ibrahim Traoré remained unyielding. Burkina Faso belongs to the Burkinabé, and its wealth will no longer be used as a down payment for its own betrayal. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back to the silence of the years before. The machinery of a coup is not built of steel alone. It is constructed from the fragile mortar of human ambition and the cold architecture of systemic corruption. To understand why Ibrahim Traoré had to freeze the lifeblood of 113 powerful individuals, one must look deep into the anatomy of the untouchable class. These were men who had come to view the state not as a sacred trust, but as a private inheritance. For decades, a system of impunity had allowed a small circle of elites to operate above the law, protected by wealth, foreign connections, and the silence of a fearful population. In this shadow world, The motivation was never about the ideology of the nation, it was about the preservation of the self. The motive for the alleged plot was the terrifying prospect of a Burkina Faso that no longer needed middlemen. When the young administration began auditing illegal contracts and reclaiming land stolen from rural communities, the elite didn't just see a change in policy, they saw the end of their era. The price to pay for sovereignty was, for them, far too high. They were willing to pay $28 million to destroy the country, rather than live in one where they were merely equal to the farmer and the teacher. Pause for a moment and share with us where you are watching this video. Is it from Africa, from Europe, from the Americas, or from a small village whose name deserves to be spoken aloud? Tell us, because every place matters. Bright Africa wants to thank you personally, and to send a wish across the distance. May freedom and dignity walk beside you, wherever you are. Let the comments be not just words, but bridges of solidarity. This systemic betrayal went beyond simple greed. It involved the calculated use of soft power as a weapon of war. Media owners, now among those with frozen assets, were accused of preparing the psychological battlefield. The plan was to use their platforms to amplify every setback, to twist every challenge into a sign of failure, and to cultivate a sense of inevitable collapse. This is the invisible price of modern political warfare, the erosion of truth itself. When those who own the megaphones are in league with those who fund the violence, the citizen's reality becomes the primary target. The investigators revealed a chilling synergy between the high-level plotters and the chaos on the ground. It was alleged that terror groups, the very enemies the nation was fighting in the trenches, were being used as tactical tools by the suit-and-tie conspirators in the capital. The violence was meant to soften the government, to bleed its resources dry, and to make the population desperate for any alternative, even a return to the men who had failed them before. The price of this ambition was paid in Burkinabe lives, a reality that turned the public's shock into a cold, hard resolve. But there is a price to be paid for justice as well. By moving against the most powerful men in the country, Ibrahim Traoré and his administration took a path of no return. They traded the comfort of political compromise for the danger of total accountability. In the international arena, this move was greeted with a mixture of alarm and calculated skepticism. To the global financial system, freezing the assets of former presidents and wealthy businessmen is a violation of the old rules. But for Burkina Faso, the old rules were the very things that had kept the nation in a state of perpetual poverty and dependency. The human cost of this struggle is visible in the eyes of the young soldiers who now guard the institutions with a new sense of purpose. They are no longer defending a corrupt system. They are defending a vision of a nation that belongs to them. However, the shadow of 1987 remains. The memory of what happened when a previous leader tried to break the chains of imperialism hangs heavy in the air. The price for such defiance has historically been high, often paid in the blood of the revolutionaries themselves. Yet, as the hearings were broadcast and the evidence of the $28 million plot was laid bare, the people realized that the ultimate price of silence was even higher. To remain silent was to allow the nation to be sold back into slavery. To remain silent was to accept that their children's future could be liquidated by a bank transfer in a foreign capital. The YouTube-safe truth of the matter is that Burkina Faso decided that it was better to face the storm of the world than to live in the quiet shame of betrayal. The elite thought that by controlling the money, they controlled the destiny of the land. They believed that once the fear of poverty or the threat of violence was applied, the people would retreat. They were wrong. They failed to account for the dignity of a people who have reached their breaking point. The asset freeze was not just a legal maneuver, it was a spiritual divorce between the nation and its exploiters. But as the courtrooms fill and the suspects are brought to light, a final question begins to emerge. In a world where the old powers are still watching and the shadows of the past refuse to fade, can a single nation truly finish the work that was started decades ago? The ghost of a fallen hero is watching, and the next chapter is about more than just one man's survival. The courtrooms of Ouagadougou have become the stage for a drama that is centuries in the making. As the public justice process unfolds, the atmosphere in Burkina Faso has transitioned from the sharp heat of fun-no indignation to a more profound, quiet reflection. To see military officers, once draped in medals of honor, and politicians, once cloaked in the sanctity of office, forced to answer for a plot funded by $28 million of shadow money, is a sight that few thought they would live to see. There is a lingering tiek nui, a regret for the years wasted under a system of impunity, where the nation's wealth was treated as a private treasury for the few, while the many suffered. But that regret was quickly being overshadowed by a surging hope, a belief that the vicious cycle of betrayal had finally been broken. This is not merely about the fate of 113 individuals. It is about the dismantling of an entire system of dependency. The government's decision to reclaim stolen land and audit illegal contracts is a signal that the revolution is moving from the streets into the very structures of the state. The sacred cows have been led to the altar of accountability, and in their place, a new sense of national purpose is being born. Every citizen watching these proceedings knows that history is a heavy burden. They look at Ibrahim Traoré, and they cannot help but see the echoes of Thomas Sankara, the young, fearless leader who, in 1987, was betrayed by the very forces of internal corruption and foreign interest that are being challenged today. The fear that this story might end in the same tragedy is real, but the context has changed. Unlike the past, the people of today are awake, informed, and active. They are no longer silent spectators. They are the primary guardians of their own sovereignty. As we prepare to end, remember, this is not the end of the road, but a seed planted in the soil of your heart. Every story of dignity, every voice of sovereignty, is part of a harvest that lies ahead. If you want to see that harvest grow, subscribe. Let this channel be the road we walk together, the light we carry forward. Your subscription is not for us alone, it is for the promise of what is still to come. Join us, and be ready for the next chapter that is already waiting to be written. The road ahead remains fraught with danger. The external shadows that encouraged and assisted this failed coup have not vanished. They have merely retreated to wait for a moment of weakness. Threats of infiltration and economic pressure continue to loom over the Sahel. Yet, the fundamental shift is irreversible. A nation that has seen its untouchable elite brought to justice cannot be easily forced back into the darkness of fear. Ibrahim Traoré is not fighting for the survival of a man, but for the survival of a vision, a Burkina Faso that stands upright, a country that cannot be bought, bullied, or bartered away. The transformation is visible in the villages receiving electricity, the farmers receiving tools, and the youth finding a purpose beyond migration or despair. The siege continues, yes, but the spirit of the people remains undefeated because a nation with an awakened population cannot be assassinated. In the final analysis, the freezing of those bank accounts was the first act of a much larger reclamation. It was the moment Burkina Faso decided to own its truth, no matter the cost. As the sun sets over the Sahel, it shines on a people who have chosen pride over comfort and sovereignty over silence. The ghost of Sankara can finally rest, for the work he left unfinished is being carried forward by millions of hands. The political game has changed forever, and the world is finally learning that in the heart of Africa, dignity is not for sale. The journey of Ibrahim Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso is a testament to the fact that when a nation finds its voice, even the loudest echoes of the past cannot drown it out. Ibrahim Traoré has shown that the true strength of a leader is not found in the weight of his gold, but in the depth of his people's resolve. Burkina Faso has crossed a line, and as they walk into the future, they do so with the knowledge that their destiny is finally and firmly in their own hands.